You have a fabulous story idea, but you're not quite sure where to start. That's what we're talking about today. As a lover of words, this verse is one of my favorite from a literary perspective because it elevates writers. The word existed from the beginning. These 6 words do what all good opening lines should do. The verse intrigues and invites the reader into the world. It encourages the reader to read the next line, and then the next, and the next. This gentle coaxing that draws the reader into the story is why first lines and beginnings matter. My all-time favorite first line is this: "The first time she slit a man's throat, she felt sick to her stomach." This line is from The Ideal Man, and it drew me into the story. I wanted to know more. Surprisingly, the book wasn't about serial killers, but Julie Garwood, who in my opinion writes killer first lines, knows how to draw the reader inexorably into her story. Her style is definitely modern. She starts in media res, as writing professors like to say, in the middle of things. But that concise, shocking first line isn't the only way into a story. Indeed, literature abounds with first lines. Let's see if you can name some of these famous first lines. "Call me Ishmael." This is probably the shortest one that I have on the list. No, it is definitely the shortest one, but it's iconic, so maybe you know what that is. The second one: "It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife." My favorite thing about this is you can hear the tone. You can hear it's definitely a female narrator, but also it sets the tone for the entire book. Third one: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was a season of darkness. It was a spring of hope, it was the winter of despair." The question writers should ask is, does the line work? Does it draw the reader into the story? For example, "Call Me Ishmael" is from a required high school reading list. Junior year, and Mr. Delmargo waxed poetic about the book I couldn't make myself finish. I didn't understand the extended metaphor or the symbolic nature of the creature being discussed. And though I've tried several times to finish the book, I really never got to the end. In fact, several years ago, I saw this title on a list of books that people lie about having read. Still, most people recognize the first line. The last example is iconic. Those who haven't read the whole book often recognize the book or the author from this line alone. The line represents a paradox between all the examples: the best and the worst, foolishness and belief, hope and despair. Such a great literary first line. Do you think you know the title? So yes, the first one, "Call Me Ishmael," is from Moby Dick by Herman Melville. The second one is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And the final one is A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. And the cool thing about the paradox he set up in the beginning is that you can see it in the title, A Tale of Two Cities. First lines draw the reader into the book, but writers must follow through with an equally compelling second and third line to create a great beginning. On the night of May 11th, at precisely 8:45 in the evening, Finn McBain stopped being a colossal pain in the ass and grew up. He also became a hero. Excuse me. So this is another Julie Garwood example, and it demonstrates that the very first line of a story, even a killer first line, only gets a writer so far. The next line and the next build to create a compelling beginning. So Garwood's entire first chapter follows up on this line, and it shows the main character as a colossal pain in the ass, as she says, but it also describes his ascent to hero, and that is definitely not an easy task for a writer. The opening scene of a story does matter. The beginning sets the tone, it introduces the setting, it establishes point of view and character, and it plants the seeds of conflict. But the weight of this, the fact that it matters, puts an inordinate amount of pressure on the writer. Writers struggle with first lines for this very reason. So in one of my works in progress, it's a literary fiction novel, and the opening has changed dozens of times. I have flip-flopped the 2 opening scenes on multiple occasions. I've revised and reimagined the first line because I really just want to get it, quote, just right. But that sense of rightness doesn't exist, at least not in the beginning before I've written the book. And I'd be better served to find almost right, or what I like to call a working opening, and finish the book, which I ultimately did. The tragedy of this, for me, in this particular first paragraph, I created a working first line in an opening paragraph that I love, but I know it has to change. And change hurts, particularly when the words that I love are not just right and they're not perfect. This particular first line is in passive voice. It starts with the word it. The opening also overtly states the theme, which I know can't stay that way. So I'm left, as I work on revisions, floundering with the question of where to start. As much as it pains me to say, forget what you learned in English class, because the thesis statements and topic sentences required in academic writing are not creative and are not designed for storytelling. Creative writing is a messy thing, or it should be, at least for nonlinear writers. This perhaps is why artificial intelligence hasn't learned how to write a novel yet, although scientists continue to try. Messiness may not be next to godliness, but chaos is less destructive than perfectionism. An ancient truth often attributed to Plato is that perfect is the enemy of the good. Or as I like to remind myself, perfect people die young. As members of the human race, writers can never attain the perfection in their minds because every word written will fail to live up to the loftiness of imagined words and stories. This ideal in the writer's mind will result in paralysis. Thus, it really is indeed the enemy of the good that could unfold on the page if writers let go of perfection and aimed for completion instead. All right, so start with what I like to call a working opening. Most plot structure recommends starting in the middle of things or right before things change for the main characters. So in a movie like John Wick, that's when he meets the man who will kill his dog and drag Wick back into the dark underworld. In the book Wild by Cheryl Strayed, she starts literally in the middle of her book, and it's kind of like a flash forward instead of a background or a flashback. It's where she loses her boot while hiking the Pacific Coastal Trail. This establishes the setting, the character, the tone, the point of view, and very effectively demonstrates the conflict of man or woman against nature. So consider the needs at the beginning again. We need tone, point of view, character, setting, and conflict. Even if the writer knows what moment in time encapsulates the beginning, how does the writer depict that moment to draw the reader into the story? Writer and college professor Sue Williams Silverman says that with fiction, she pretends that she's watching a movie whereby I copied down images I saw in my mind's eye. With a memoir, however, it's as if you're inside the movie, inside your own life, whereby you not only see images, but you taste, smell, hear, and touch the images. You are the movie. So select those sensory details that best illustrate you in your world. As a writer, with my fiction or creative nonfiction, I often have the movie playing. It's in my head on repeat for hours, days, sometimes weeks before or after sleep, sometimes during sleep, in the shower, on a walk, long before I put words to paper. So some books open like a movie with a broad panoramic view. This is the way I see the opening of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. The village of Holcomb stands on the high wheat plains of Kansas, a lonesome area that other Kansans call out there. Some 70 miles east of the Colorado border, the countryside, with its hard blue skies and desert clear air, has an atmosphere that is rather more far west than Middle West. The local accent is barbed with a prairie twang, a ranch hand nasalness, and the men, many of them, wear narrow frontier trousers, Stetsons, and high-heeled boots with pointy toes. The land is flat, and the views are awesomely extensive. Horses, herds of cattle, a white cluster of grain elevators rising as gracefully as Greek temples are visible long before a traveler reaches them. So this provides a panoramic view that reveals the story gently. What I love about this, if you've been on the eastern plains of Colorado, it's almost an extension of this, and I can picture this in my mind for every trip that I've made through Kansas. The setting is slowly described with concrete sensory details, and that's vital. The reader senses a gentle narration, which is the point of view, and the words set the tone, which is at odds with the horrific nature of the crimes. In fact, the opening scenery pits the setting against the conflict, where the reader finally arrives as the view narrows. At the time, not a soul in sleeping Holcomb heard them. 4 gunshot blasts that all told ended 6 human lives. The narration makes the reader wonder how this bucolic place could produce such horror, and thus the beginning sets the tone, the setting, hints at character, and establishes a conflict, all in a movie-like view of the Kansas plains. So one reason for the success of this opening is the strong use of imagery. The language is active. There are very few telling verbs, and the sensory details lead the reader from the panoramic view past the plains, across the railway, over the river, and yes, that's literally over the river, and into the town of Holcomb, with a sweeping view of the postmistress, the cafe, the school, each descriptive line leading us closer to the conflict, the murders. So now we've talked about how to start or begin a story, we're going to talk about the ending. So the ending of the story is where, after the climax and the denouement, the author ties up all loose ends, making sure that any unresolved plot lines are closed. So in Star Wars, which we've talked about in the past, the ending is the medal scene. In the movie Home Alone, the ending is when the family returns and Kevin looks out the window to see that his elderly neighbor reunites with his estranged son and granddaughter. How to end a story is a matter of tone and personal style. I'm a big fan of echoing the introduction in the ending. This is where the protagonist returns to the original setting but as a changed man. So in Star Wars, for instance, imagine, if you can, an ending that ended not with the medal scene, but back on Tatooine, where Luke's aunt and uncle were murdered by stormtroopers. That would be echoing the introduction. In the movie While You Were Sleeping, it does it really well, as the story starts and ends with the main character who's working in the subway, taking tokens, but she has changed just as her life has changed. And so even though we're back at the beginning, there's been growth in the character. Christopher Vogler, author of The Writer's Journey, calls this a circular story form. The ending of a story for Vogler is the mythological return with the elixir. Having survived all the ordeals, having lived through death, heroes return to their starting place. They go home or continue their journey, but they always proceed with the sense that they are commencing a new life on what will forever be different because of the road just traveled. As a writer, I prefer to write by the seat of my pants, and I've said before we call this pantsers. I've also heard it called a discovery writer, which I really like the idea that we're discovering our plot as we write. So in translation, I really just like to wing it most of the time. But for some reason, I can't write the book until I know the ending. So when that movie reel is playing in my head, part of that opening movie reel connects to the ending that I have to know. And probably because I like to write this circular story form, I need to know the ending before I know the beginning or before I write the beginning. Writers who plot know how the story will end before they begin. Pantsers, like myself, however, let the story unfold organically. When this happens, there's often a disconnect between how the story started and the ultimate ending. For plotters, those who pre-plot, the challenge is to leave room for inspiration in the middle of the book. But for pantsers, the challenge is to revise the beginning once the ending is finished. And so each person is taking time with this aspect. The plotter takes the time at the beginning, and then the pantser takes the time at the end after they finish to do the revisions. So either way, the reader should get a sense of closure from the ending. While the characters should appear as if they continue on their life's journey outside the confines of the book, the story presented should feel complete. Or, as I alluded to earlier, the reader should recognize that it is finished. And you'll note that that line, "it is finished," is also from the book of John, for those of you who have studied the Christian New Testament. And so what I did there was essentially create that same sense of ending with the video, where we start in one place and we get to the ending, "it is finished." All right, so now we're going to work on some writing prompts. But first, I'll take some questions.